Hi, I'm golf instructor Steve Bishop out at Rio Salado Golf Course in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. And today we're going to be taking a look at Doug, who came to me originally with some issues with distance. And so generally what I do with students who are working on trying to gain more distance, we work first on their release and making sure that that happens correctly. Once we get done targeting a specific area, then I try to go back to my 5 basic steps, which of course are equipment, setup, finish, balance, and relax. For Doug, what we now are starting to work on is step 2 of that, which is the setup. Doug has finally gotten basically used to his release, which has caused him to finish correctly. So now we need to kind of backtrack a little bit and get back to his setup so that he can make, not only do his good swings make better contact, but he'll be a little bit more consistent. One of the unique things about Doug's swing is that he does have a rather large loop in his swing, in his backswing. And one of the really great things I think about this 5-step plan is that even with something as significant as Doug's loop in his swing, he's still actually striking the ball better, making better contact, and he's hitting the ball further with more consistency, even though he still has the same loop in his swing that he's always had. It's just that he's a lot more consistent with it because we're going over those 5 steps. So this lesson that we went over this last weekend was in setup, and here we see Doug's basic setup beforehand, before we even begin the lesson, and you can clearly see that his hands and the club are pretty far behind the ball, about a good 4 inches, and his hands are all the way back up here off of his right thigh. The other significant thing that we can take a look at is his spine tilt is almost non-existent. He's pretty much straight up and down, especially when you compare it to the ground. Basically, it's kind of at a slope there, so he's pretty much straight up and down with his spine angle. His weight distribution, I think, is pretty good. He's just a little bit on his right foot, which I think is okay. I would just think, I just really like to see those hands move a little bit forward. So when we approached, let me go ahead and progress through his swing here. When we get to Doug's swing, or his setup after the lesson, we see a slight move back with his hands, but he will adjust for that here in just a moment. Okay, now this is just before he's about ready to take that club back, and what we can clearly see is even though his hands are still slightly back a little bit from where I'd like them to be, I think you can quite clearly see his hands are much closer to that left hip, that left thigh, as opposed to in his setup originally they were back here. And I find this a marked improvement, and you can see that club is much closer to the ball. So this is quite clearly an improvement of his hand position. One of the things that you hear all the time is that you want the hands to be ahead of the ball at impact. And I don't think that enough explanation as to why you want that really happens. You may hear it's a descending blow that you're creating to the ball. I actually think that there's a little bit more intricate detail to that. I strongly and firmly believe that you should attempt to be trying to accelerate as you make contact with the ball. The idea being behind acceleration is that if you are still continuing to accelerate at the time that you make contact with the ball and the club will remain in contact for a longer period of time. And by lengthening that time, I do believe that you allow for a better transfer of energy from the club to the ball. So that's why compression feels so good to me. Compression is really just the sustaining of the ball being on the club face for a slightly longer period of time and being in balance with the center of the club face. But I do believe that you get better compression, obviously, when you're accelerating than when you're decelerating. You create kind of a glancing blow when you're decelerating. Keeping the hands in front of the ball basically ensures that the club is still trying to reach as far away from your swing center as possible. If your hands are slightly ahead of it, the full extension, the full distance between the club head and your swing center has not been reached, which means the club has to still be accelerating by the time that it makes contact with the ball. So by keeping the hands in front of the ball, you are in fact ensuring that there is going to be acceleration through impact. Going back to Doug's setup here, his spine tilt is obviously much better. He has turned his head a little bit in order to try to really get that to happen. The good thing is that he's also done a little bit of it with his hips. His hips have shifted a little bit forward here. So it's not all just strictly tilt of his upper body back over his right foot. He's still relatively well centered over his feet, maybe just about 60-40, 60 favoring his right leg. Moving on, let's go ahead and play on through here. Let's see here. Let's clear those lines. And we'll see he's got a pretty significant up and down motion there. But he does finish pretty well, which is one of the reasons he has good contact. Now this is Doug's swing before we began the lesson, and as you can see, probably the most significant thing that we see here is this arch to his back here, and the lack of distance basically between his shoulders and his chin. This does not allow for his shoulders to basically properly rotate around his spine, and his chin is in effect going to get in the way of his swing. And he's really kind of gotten used to that, so he's learned to kind of lift up a little bit even with that. With his balance from heel to toe, we can see his rear end is quite far behind his, there's a big gap here between his heels and his rear end. And from his shoulder to his toes, you can see that there's not a whole heck of a lot of distance there. So we clearly have more weight on his heels than he does over his toes. If we go ahead and clear those, we'll progress on through Doug's swing here. And we'll see the big lift up and back through, which he did shorten his swing there for that one. Again, we have a pretty good finish there with Doug. Now, this is Doug after the lesson. We can clearly see, look at this, this is beautiful separation between his chin and his shoulders. This posture, this setup here, really allows for his shoulders to rotate around his spine without interference of his chin. You can see his back is much straighter. This is much better. We also see that his rear end is still a little bit behind him. I don't really particularly like that, but it's definitely a lot better. There's not a huge gap there anymore. I would like to see a little bit more bow to his setup rather than sitting down on his rear end there, basically. And I hope that this has been informative to you. I hope some of you can see the definite significant change here. Again, I'll just go back here. This is Doug's old setup here. And going back here to his setup afterwards, you can definitely see the posture is much better, much more athletic, and able to rotate those shoulders without getting the chin in the way.